So let's talk about lead development. Remember, in news writing, we talk about the lead. L-E-A-D is the proper spelling, but for journalistic purposes, it's often spelled L-E-D-E or L-E-E-D. Lead is the word, not lead. So when an editor says, I want you to write a really strong lead, or a colorful lead, or an interesting lead, or an entertaining lead, they're talking about the beginning of your news story. The first sentence or two or three. People will vary on their definition of the length of a lead or what really constitutes the lead. For our purposes, we're talking about the first sentence or two of your story is the lead of your story. For right now, that's a good place to begin. Later, you might develop leads that go on for one or two paragraphs in your story. So I'm looking at my favorite newspaper in Kuwait, the Kuwait Times. Actually, I shouldn't have said that because I like the Arab Times as well. But I used to write for this paper, and I spend more time with it. And they give it to me for free, so why not like it? So here, the news page, this is the front page of the Kuwait Times. And you see the big news story is that the MPs approve, well, I can't read it, and approve extra KD, 150 million for Eurofighter warplanes. Okay, that's the lead story in actually yesterday's newspaper. I didn't get today's paper yet. All right, so what's the lead of the story? I'm going to read to you the beginning. It says that the National Assembly yesterday approved a law allowing the government to withdraw 150 KD million from state reserves to support the defense ministry. That's the first sentence. I'm going to read it again, a little bit faster this time. The National Assembly yesterday approved a law allowing the government to withdraw 150 KD million from the state reserves to support the defense ministry. Now that's the first sentence. That's the lead of this story. What do we know from that information? What do we know about the who, what, where, why, when, and how of the story? Keeping in mind that all 5 W's and H don't always exist in every story. So, what do we know about this story? Well, we know that the National Assembly did something. And in this case, the who is not always a person. The who could be a body. In this case, the National Assembly. Now, some people would say, well, that's the what? Well, not really. The National Assembly is a what, because it's not a live human being. It represents a body of live human beings, like a company. Coca-Cola isn't a who, but you could talk about it in the sense of that's who did something. Coca-Cola is who did something. In this case, the National Assembly is the who, so we know that. Yesterday, right away we know when did this happen. So we know who did something, and we know when they did it. They did it yesterday, which also makes it timely. And of course, the National Assembly of Kuwait has proximity. And we don't know if there's any consequence to the story necessarily. We don't know about impact to the story. We don't know if there's really prominence to the story, although the National Assembly is prominent. So you see it has numerous news values, and we know the who of the story, we know the when of the story. Approved a law allowing the government to withdraw 150 million KD from the state reserves. Well, what did they do? Now we know the what. What did the National Assembly do yesterday? Well, they approved this legislation, or maybe it's not a law, but they approved a motion that says the government can take 150 million KD out of the state reserves to support the defense ministry. So we know who did it, we know when it was done, we know what was done, we even know where it was done because it's at the National Assembly. Now, do we know why it was done? Not necessarily. Do we know how it was done? Not necessarily, other than we would assume somebody made a motion, maybe they debated that motion, and then they ultimately passed the motion. But you see, that information that we're wondering about is not as important. The most important part of this story is what we just read. The National Assembly did something yesterday. The National Assembly yesterday approved this law, not just a motion, approved a law that allows the government to withdraw 150 million KD from the state reserves to support the defense ministry. End of sentence and end of lead, technically. Defense Minister Sheikh Khalid Al-Jarrah Al-Sabah said the money will be used to make an advance payment for the purchase of Eurofighter warplanes. End of sentence. That's the end of the second sentence. Really still part of the lead. Technically part of the lead because it's giving us now further clarification. But you see, it wouldn't have made sense to tell us about what the Sheikh said, the defense minister, what he said. It wouldn't have made sense to tell that first, because in order for the reader to understand, to process the information, we had to know what happened, who did what. We have to put it in context. And so that's why we're ordering the material, the content, the way it's being ordered, starting with the first sentence the way they did, and then now explaining more to that first sentence. To back it up, to give you more in-depth information, we're talking about what the defense minister said. And by the way, it's not a direct quote, it's paraphrasing the defense minister. Then the third sentence says, head of the Budgets Committee, MP, Member of Parliament, Adnan Abdul Samad said the value of the warplanes deal is KD 2.6 billion in end of the third sentence. Then in January, the Assembly approved additional funds of KD 3 billion for military purchases over the next 10 years. The Eurofighter Consortium said in September that Kuwait had agreed to buy 28 Typhoon jets. And that's the end of the first paragraph. So there are 4 sentences in that first paragraph. Technically, that's the lead. I'm getting a cramp in my leg. Technically, that's the lead paragraph, but all the elements are there. Now, you would have had to ask for this information as a reporter, or it could have been given to you by the press office of the National Assembly wrote a press release to explain this information. And you might not have had an opportunity to interview a member of Parliament, but in a case where you did, where the National Assembly is your beat. Remember, we talked about a news beat. Some people cover the police. Some people cover fashion. Some people cover food, restaurants. Maybe your job at the Kuwait Times is to cover the National Assembly, which means that probably every day the National Assembly meets, you're at the National Assembly watching what's going on, listening to what's going on, recording what's going on, and talking to people to get information. So in this case, we clearly know who did what, we know what they did, we know when they did it, we know where it happened, and we know now why they did it, because Kuwait is going to spend billions to get these warplanes, and also all of this is for the defense of the country. So makes sense, right? Gives you some dissection of a lead. I hope that's helpful, and there's more to come on this. Stand by.